Today we get the chance to talk about what happens after the Civil War, after General Lee surrenders, and after everyone in the nation agrees it's time to take a different direction. The problem is which direction? Today our story is going to be about all of the different perspectives and all of the different directions that people choose to take. At the core of the story, we're going to talk about John Wilkes Booth, Abraham Lincoln, and several others who suggested and affected the directions that we took after the Civil War. So let's go ahead and get started, find out what our learning objectives are so that we know where we're headed. For the rest of the time, the big question we need to keep in mind as we're going along is what was the immediate social and economic aftermath of the Civil War? In addition, in what way did people like Abraham Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth try to help the post-Civil War South, among others that we'll talk about? So the first thing we need to ask is, in what ways did the South's economy suffer in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War? This is going to help us to better understand why people reacted the way they did later on during Reconstruction. Second, how did opinions towards former slaves change immediately after the war? Why did they get worse? Why did things not improve? And how did freed slaves respond to their former owners? What was the 10% plan? How was it different from the Wade-Davis proposal? What is the Wade-Davis proposal? Why did John Wilkes Booth seek to assassinate President Lincoln? Did Lincoln's death fulfill Booth's goals? And how did the people in the South and North react to Lincoln's assassination? Alright, goal number one. Why does the Southern economy crash? The first real reason is the loss of population. When you're in a war, people die. The second is a loss of labor. As you guys know, after the Civil War is over, all African Americans are free. Now, that means different things to different people, but their free labor is over. So in terms of loss of population, the South actually loses a fifth of all adult white males. That is a huge amount of the population that's just lost. In terms of labor, their economy is based on a free labor system, and that's been taken away from them. So we have to ask the next question, how does this affect them financially? It affects them horrifically. The first thing is the fields. Most of the fields that they have, either for cotton or for agriculture, are fallow. In other words, they haven't been farmed. So people aren't eating, people certainly aren't farming cotton. There's a lot of problems going on. What little factories the South did have are in ruin. In terms of value of land, they lose up to 50% of the value of their land after the Civil War is over. In some states, they even have negative manufacturing growth, like in Alabama, Virginia, and Florida. Other states, like Arkansas and Louisiana, actually lose railroad mileage, and overall, the catastrophic cost of the war is $500 million in capital for the South. That is almost unsustainable. The other issue, of course, is starvation, which is pretty big. Starvation is so bad, and you may have already heard this, but it's so bad that Lee asks Grant if he will give any kind of aid towards food, and Grant does grant a 3 days worth of supply for food for 25,000 men. And finally, the Confederate cash is worthless. One woman, Julia Johnson, sums it up pretty well when she says, "Our little pig is gone, and we are again without meat, but having milk and occasionally a dish of greens." What a sad diet. And it's really important to understand the devastation and the depression that both African Americans and white people are facing in the South after the Civil War is over. Considering all this hardship leads us to talk about goal 2, the black and white divide. What happens in the face of all of this poverty and devastation? First is, how do former slave owners and general white people in the South feel about what's happened in terms of their social upheaval and economic upheaval? First of all, former slave owners have lost their entire free system of labor, so they're feeling the financial pressure and the financial issues that are arising from this. The other issue that comes up is, what is the new role of the African American? In this picture that you're seeing, you see all kinds of myths and stereotypes and incredible racial slurs that arise to depict a very terrifying and very uncertain African American person. It also shows, if you notice, white slave owners or Southern aristocracy being reduced into service positions. So no white person is certain of what to expect, or even if they are, they definitely have a myth surrounding the problems that may arise from freed slaves. The other issue is that now former slave owners, even though they've treated slaves poorly in the past, in fact horrendously, They have no obligatory need to take care of slaves in whatever way they were doing so before. So no matter how bad violence was before, it continues, unfortunately, into the post-Civil War South, taking the form of the incredibly heinous and incredibly ugly Ku Klux Klan, which forms in 1865 and serves as a terrifying reminder of the prejudices and stereotypes that continue long after the war is over. So the next question is, faced with all this hostility, what is the African American community doing? One of the first things they're doing is they're voting with their feet, and they're leaving the South. In this picture you see in front of you, this is actually the Kairos House for Freed Women that's up in the north. And a lot of African Americans are finding more and more homes and facilities that are open to them to try and help them make that transition. The other thing that's happening is former masters are asking their slaves to come back. In one instance, Jordan Anderson, who was a freed slave, was asked to come back, and this is the response he gave to his former master. "I got your letter, and was glad to find you had not forgotten Jordan, and that you wanted me to come back and live with you again, promising to do better for me than anybody else. I have often felt uneasy about you. I thought the Yankees would have hung you long before this for harboring Rebs they found at your house." So it doesn't sound like Jordan is too interested in returning home. In the North, a lot of Union soldiers are actually advocating for equal opportunity in terms of employment, but that's not going well either. The other major institution that happens is the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau. This is about March 3rd, 1865, so a little bit before the surrender. The Freedmen's Bureau does a lot of good things. Issues food, supplies, especially medical supplies, provides schools for almost 250,000 African Americans, provides a lease-to-own program. Unfortunately, though, it's a very short-lived institution. It doesn't survive past 1870, and a lot of that is because when Johnson comes in during Reconstruction, he's not very supportive. And Southerners, as you can imagine, aren't very supportive either, because they believe that it's some kind of a Northern conspiracy to redistribute their land. So unfortunately, African Americans, while they have a lot of institutions to help them, are equally discouraged by the hostility that they continue to face. Long before any of these racial tensions happens, we're at goal 3, which is how does Lincoln and everybody else deal with the issue of putting the Union back together? Well, Lincoln doesn't even like the term Reconstruction. He likes the term restoration, in other words, restoring something to what it should and always was. Part of this is way back in 1863, before the war is over, he issues the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconciliation. The goals of amnesty and reconciliation are basically to help shorten the Civil War by enticing the South to come to a close, and ensures the survival of the Emancipation Proclamation by requiring the South to continue to follow the Emancipation Proclamation. Out of this comes his 10% plan. So what is the 10% plan? Well, first of all, at least 10% of voters had to take an oath of allegiance in order to be readmitted into the Union. State governments had to promise to uphold the Emancipation Proclamation. They had to create new governments. Executive rights and representation is restored. And also appealing to the Southern aristocracy is that he guarantees the protection of property for plantation owners, as well as amnesty for all Confederates, which appeals to obviously all social classes. So what happens? Why doesn't the 10% plan go through? First of all, it only is instituted in occupied areas of the Union. Obviously, it can't be where they're not. Louisiana jumps on board with this. They attempt to follow these terms in 1864 before the South has officially surrendered, and they're denied. And they're denied because Congress is worried that this plan offers too much lenience for the South, and that the Southern aristocrats will have the tools necessary to reform solid and independent governments. Lincoln's upset by this, but not a lot can happen because he decides to see a play, and you can't do much about that. On the other side is the congressional proposal, which is something called the Wade-Davis Bill. This is a lot more stringent in its requirements. It requires the South to provide a 50% oath of allegiance. New governments that are formed cannot be from anyone that took up arms against the North. It establishes congressional power over the Reconstruction process, which is what they call it. And they also want to reaffirm that slavery is abolished, not just uphold the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln doesn't feel like this is going to be very helpful or constructive, and so he gives Henry Davis, featured in the picture above, a no. So by April 1865, everybody knows the direction they want to take, but nobody's able to take the direction they want, except one guy, John Wilkes Booth. Who is John Wilkes Booth, and why does he want to assassinate President Lincoln? That's part of Goal 4. Well, John Wilkes Booth is an actor. He never fought in the Civil War, but he definitely felt guilty about not doing so. He was actually a very wealthy actor. His annual salary was $20,000, when the annual salary at the time, the average annual salary, was $300 a year. Booth believed that while the South had surrendered, he could still change the fortunes of the South. And the way that he planned on doing this was through an elaborate scheme to first kidnap President Lincoln. And it may seem silly to kidnap the president. What you have to understand is back then, there weren't a lot of bodyguards around President Lincoln. In fact, he would oftentimes go off on his own walking. So it wasn't that inconceivable. And remember, Booth is wealthy. He has a lot of money. So what he does is he pulls together many of his Confederates, and they plan an elaborate kidnapping involving ropes lowering Lincoln onto the stage, but it doesn't work because Lincoln's itinerary changes. And so the plans fall through and the plot falls apart. Upset and frustrated, Booth actually has to wait another month before he gets another opportunity. This time he's actually listening to the president's speech, what will be his last, and the president actually suggests in a speech out in front of the Capitol that African Americans who are literate may actually deserve the right to vote, which enrages Booth. After this, Booth only has to wait a couple more days before he gets a lucky break, so to speak. He lives next door to Ford Theater, and they actually hold his mail for him. When he goes to pick up the mail the next day, he hears, out of excitement, that the president is coming to see our American cousin. Booth is ecstatic. He only has 8 hours to plan, but he knows he can do it, and so he goes and prepares the assassination of President Lincoln by calling together his Confederates Lewis Powell and George. He decides, though, that this time it needs to be a lot larger than just the president. In order to really help the South, it's going to have to be 4 major players in order to really destabilize the North enough that the South can regroup. So he plans that Grant and Lincoln, who are supposed to be seeing the play together, will be shot by him, Booth, and that Secretary of State Seward will be shot by Lewis Powell, and that George will take care of Vice President Johnson. He even goes in the middle of the day to the private box of the president up in Ford Theater to mark a notch in the wall where he can bar the door when he does the actual deed. Now Booth is set, and the plan is ready for action. Around 10 o'clock that evening, plan is ready to go, and so Booth comes, and he doesn't have to wear a disguise because he's actually a pretty famous actor. Nobody asks any questions. Goes upstairs, and he sees that President Lincoln's valet is actually there, so he has to wait a little bit for him to leave, goes off to a tavern, and then Booth quietly goes up into the anteroom, bars the door, comes up behind the president, and shoots him point blank in the head. At which point he tries to jump out of the box, but actually gets caught by a spur on his shoe, where he falls onto the stage, and he actually shatters his ankle. After which he stands up with his shattered ankle and yells, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. Then Booth manages to get away, and what ensues is one of the largest, in fact the largest manhunt in the history of the United States up until that point. Amidst all the chaos and confusion that Booth caused, Lewis Powell was equally engaged in trying to kill Secretary of State Seward. Powell was able to gain access to Seward's house because he convinced his family that he was here at the home to drop off medical supplies that Seward actually needed because he'd been in a horrible carriage accident. When Powell reaches Seward's room and attempts to stab Seward, and in fact does stab Seward, he's not able to reach the main artery on his neck because of the wire contraption that Seward had to wear due to his injury. Powell is unsuccessful in fatally stabbing Seward, although he does stab him several times, and on his way out stabs another family member, runs out into the street, and is gone. The last would-be assassin is George. George is supposed to assassinate Vice President Johnson, but George never makes the attempt, and so Johnson remains safe. When it's discovered that Lincoln is actually still alive, he's brought back to the Peterson home, or boarding home, and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton actually begins to organize what becomes the largest manhunt in the history of the United States to seek out the would-be assassins. And unfortunately, of course, Lincoln did not survive the wound and died the next morning. With the help of his friend, Harold, Booth is actually able to escape the city. Unfortunately for Lewis Powell, Harold was not there to help him escape the city, where he got lost and actually, by fate, ended up in the boarding house of another conspirator that had helped them the very time she was being questioned. And so he was actually captured. Even though Booth was initially able to get away, faced with the largest manhunt in the history of the United States, he wasn't able to elude authorities for very long. 12 days later, he was actually cornered in a barn and shot. However, even before Booth died, he realized that his assassination attempt in helping the South to regroup had not been successful. He heard this both from passerbys as well as from the people that he stayed with. He also was shocked to find that people were not sympathetic towards the assassination attempt or towards him. This brings us to our final goal, Goal 5. How do people react to Lincoln's death? As you can probably imagine, in the North, people are outraged. They're disgusted. One chronicler, Carolyn Richards, reports, "The news came this morning that our dear President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated yesterday, on the day appointed for Thanksgiving for Union victories. I have felt sick over it all day, and so has everyone that I have seen." In the South, reaction is mixed. Publicly, people do show outrage, and privately, we know it's mixed because of people's accounts. Emma Florence LeConte said, "Hurrah! Old Abe Lincoln has been assassinated. It may be abstractly wrong to be so jubilant, but I just can't help it." So, in reality, while everyone had their own opinion about what was the right direction to take, nobody actually got to take the direction they had hoped to, except perhaps for some radical Republicans and Johnson, which you'll learn about next time in your lecture. Thanks for sticking with it, guys. I'll see you on Monday. We'll be doing some really cool primary source group activities in class. So make sure that you know those goals so you can be prepared to have a good, guided, and constructive discussion. Thanks a lot.